Okay, everybody, and welcome to another episode here of the Future Ear Radio podcast. I am stoked today to be joined by two great gentlemen. I have Ross O'Neill and Professor Hubert Lim with the company Neuromod and their product Lenire. So, guys, how are we doing today? Thanks for coming on.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having us, David. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, as mentioned, wanted to bring you two on. I would say that Lenire was absolutely one of the stars of the show at this year's ADA conference and has been, I think, kind of up at the top of the list of most talked about developments within this industry. I, for one, have been have not avoided, expressing my excitement and enthusiasm about this. I think this is a really, really exciting development for the industry, for the profession, and obviously for the patients. So I wanted to have these two guys on today to just sort of share the story of how Neuromod started, how Lenire came to be, how you two met. So with that, I will kick it over. Why don't I kick it over to you, Ross, and let you kind of set the stage however you want and go back to the start when this was all just an idea.
Yeah, so thanks, David. So I guess it started back in university back in Ireland. I was part of a research group, and we were looking at these collection of disorders that we call the illusory perceptual disorders. So they would include phantom limb pain, tinnitus, Charles Bonnet, which is a illusory perceptual disorder of the visual system. There's kind of one for almost every system, and we were looking at how could we develop neuromodulation interventions for these. And I guess I always had entrepreneurial ambitions, always wanted to start a company in the medical devices space. And, anytime we advertised, even for a small study in the university for tinnitus patients, we'd have people queuing around the block. So it was very, unsophisticated, palpable, first-hand, evidence of a major unmet hearing healthcare need. So it was pretty obvious. And so whenever I talked to ENTs or audiologists, they said, wow, so many tinnitus patients, if you ever develop anything for these guys, it'll be a game changer. So that was it. I didn't really need much more evidence to say that this is the opportunity. So I started to look at it. So at the time, the interventions were mostly sound-based interventions like hearing aids, sound therapies. There was stuff on the cognitive behavioral side as well. But what the literature was saying at the time was that these sound-based therapies don't provide a lasting relief in the brain. They don't hardwire the effect into the brain. They provide relief while the patient is using the hearing aids, but if they take them off at night to go to sleep, then the tinnitus spikes, and they find it hard to get to sleep, and that's one of the major quality of life things that you hear patients talking about. So we started looking at ways then how could we make that effect more long lasting or hardwire it into the brain. So we started looking at this idea of bimodal. So, there were approaches called pair-dissociative stimulation, which Hubert can talk to in detail, but they date right back to Pavlov and his dogs. And it's where you pair one stimulus with another. And that's where we came up with the idea. And I think, as we started working on the technology and the literature was growing, I became aware of Hubert, who was working in Minnesota. And he, I remember in 2015, he wrote a paper where they looked at different stimulation sites of, where you paired sound at different stimulation sites in the body. And one of the sites that really stood out was the tongue. It was like one of the optimal sites. And, we joked that if we didn't know Hubert at the time, but we joked that if we paid him, he couldn't have written a better paper for us, because his study found that one of the best places to stimulate was the tongue, which was where we had kind of identified as an optimal target as well. So it was kind of a happen chance that we kind of both kind of ended up on that target site, and And then, as we kind of really started to gain momentum in the company, we had formed a science advisory board, which included Professor Sven Van Est, and he jokingly told me that if there were two guys that were ever meant to work together, it was me and Hubert Lim. So, so I found out what he meant by that later after I got introduced to Hubert. But yeah, it's been a very, very exciting time working together with Hubert on this.
That's so cool. Okay. Kind of continuing on this, Hubert, how about, you fill us in on what was going on in your world leading up to even being introduced and approached by Ross about joining the scientific advisory board. Clearly you were doing some research in the bimodal neuromodulation type studies. So I'd be really curious to hear what even kind of got you interested in that and how these two paths ultimately were positioned to even meet.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I actually knew of Ross and Neuromod since 2011-12 time because they had some media out about their approach. I actually wasn't a tinnitus researcher. Initially 2000 I did my Ph.D. at University of Michigan, and I was focusing on central auditory implants. So like cochlear implants where you stimulate the nerve portion of the cochlea to activate those pathways to the brain to restore hearing in deaf individuals. But I was trying to approach it from a deep brain stimulation approach, directly stimulate the brainstem, the midbrain. So I focused that on my PhD. And then in 2006, I moved to Germany because I was able to run a clinical trial for deep brain stimulation for hearing in the auditory midbrain initially, but also worked with a lot of patients who are implanted at the cochlear nucleus. So that's like the brainstem, the auditory portion of the brainstem. What was interesting though was, because tinnitus is linked to hearing loss, right? A lot of these individuals who are getting these hearing implants have tinnitus. And the challenge with these implants, and, I guess it was a disadvantage for the research I was doing at the time, but it was very intriguing from a tinnitus perspective, is the electrodes were not always placed in the proper regions. They were placed in some of the non-auditory pathways of the brain. And so we would end up stimulating those to see if we could get an auditory sensation. And a good number, honestly, a lot of them, we were actually able to modulate the tinnitus in these patients. And so that was actually my first entry. That was around 2007-ish time. And I thought to myself, geez, if we could stimulate these non-auditory pathways and modulate the tinnitus, that would be potentially a game changer for the tinnitus field, thinking of implants, right? And then I started to research more, and I was already interested in paired stimulation for my PhD, looking at sounds paired with body stim or invasive stim, but it wasn't an issue for tinnitus. It was trying to cause learning and plasticity in the brain. So this all started to converge together. And when I went to University of Minnesota, actually my job talk in 2008 was about using paired stimulation for treating tinnitus. But it was actually to do invasive implants, stimulate the somatosensory pathways, stimulate the cortex, and then pair it with sounds to drive, or Ross was talking about this paired plasticity, right? And induce these changes. So then I came to Minnesota in 2009 and realized, geez, trying to push implantable technologies and get it, to patients is going to be a long journey. And so I split my lab 50-50, 50% implantables, but then 50% was, can we try to access some of these, non-auditory, but reinforcement signals non-invasively by stimulating the body? And that's the paper that Ross was talking about. I just looked at lots of different body locations in animal studies, and then it just happened. And I'll be honest, Ross, you know this, I didn't want to publish it because at the time Ross was my competitor, or I viewed him as a competitor, but the data showed that electrical stimulation of the ear was a pretty strong driver of this paired plasticity, and electrical stimulation of the tongue was also. And so in that paper, in the discussion, the data is the data. So we wrote a paragraph to say tongue stimulation combined with sound is really a promising direction to pursue. And that's how Ross found that paper, and then we connected at the time. Just for your audience, I mean, just to understand, paired plasticity, it's not that complicated, pretty straightforward. It's basically, we already know that you play sounds, the brain's going to be attending to it. But if you pair a reinforcer, right? Could be body stim, could be food. It's going to cause your brain to attend to that even more aggressively. And Pavlovian conditioning is the key example where a bell means nothing to the dog. You pair it with food, and then now when you just play the bell, the dog will salivate, to the bell sound. And people have done experiments to show that that's coded in the brain, right? And it's enhanced the sensitivity of the brain to that sound. And so we're just using that concept. It's not, it's not that complicated, but the way we use it is actually kind of the inverse. If you have tinnitus sound, ultimately, if we can ideally create this, is to figure out what sounds are not your tinnitus, and then you pair it to those sounds, and it shifts the brain away from the tinnitus. So that's for your audience. That's the general idea of it.
Yeah, what I'd add to that is that, that tinnitus is really the combination of three kind of nodes in a network in the brain that feed off each other. One is audiological, right? It's the illusory audiological percept. You wake up one morning and you hear a sound that wasn't there before, right? So what happens next is you pay attention to it, right? So that's the second node, is attentional. And, you go, what the hell was that? Like, it's like I turn my head and it's everywhere. It's, it shouldn't be there. And so then the next thing is it kind of frightens you. So that's the emotional node. And those three nodes kind of feed off each other. And I guess what historically some of the treatment approaches have been to attack either the audiological node or the emotional node. So cognitive behavioral therapy would seek to attack the emotional node. Hearing aids and sound therapy would try to attack the audiological, but nobody has ever really gone after the attentional node. And this paired associative stimulation approach is just so incredibly powerful in the brain. And attention can be directed either to something or away from something using this approach of combining two synchronous stimuli. And it's just the way the brain, kind of assesses the world and measures the world. It uses these Bayesian models. And if two things start arriving in on two different inputs at the same time, the brain goes, okay, this has to be really important. Let's start paying attention to it. So that's really the basis of the approach of bimodal neuromodulation.
I think Ross should be the chief scientific officer, though. That was actually really good, Ross. I'm a believer.
Well, what I find really interesting about this is, I want to ask you, like, what was that landscape like when you were kind of, you were coming at this from a research standpoint, Ross? Sounds like, you were already sort of envisioning what this product might look like, but from a broader healthcare standpoint, outside of audiology, outside of tinnitus, what other kinds of, it seems like this whole novel approach of really going and doing this paired stimuli activity, these brain-based activities, were there other examples that you were sort of taking your cues from, whether it's like in the vision space or, some of these different disorders that you mentioned at the top? I mean, where was the science at from that standpoint? Because it seems to me like what is so exciting is we're getting our first introduction as an industry of what these, sort of synchronous stimuli approaches look like and what can be done. And maybe this introduces whole new ways of treating things and providing therapies. But a lot of it seems nascent. A lot of it's like, this is a totally new frontier of science in general. And I would be really curious of what's come before that's sort of Lenire-esque, but for a different segment, different vertical, for a different kind of disorder.
Well, the one that really that I thought was pretty cool that was mirror therapy for phantom limb pain. So where you'd lose maybe the lower half of your arm, and you'd experience this excruciating pain in this limb that was no longer there. And so they used mirror therapy. So they would hold a mirror in front of the missing portion of the limb, and then with the other arm, they would maybe get you to do an exercise like dumbbell curls or something like that, and it would look like you were doing it in both arms, and they'd tell the patient to imagine it in both arms. So that was one of the early things that I saw that I thought that is pretty cool, because the brain is now going to sense check the pain signals that it's getting on the missing limb, right? It's going to say, because if it's getting really strong pain signals, it's not going to question it, right? But if you were sending in a contradictory input from another sense, which is vision, it's going to say, okay, we need to sense check this pain. And, and then when that feeds into those Bayesian models, then what it does is it weakens the pain signal. So that was one of the kind of the early things that I saw that really made me think, this could work for tinnitus, because the problem is with tinnitus, as Hubert said, your brain is paying too much attention to this one sound. And it's because it's kind of gripped in a kind of a fear state, and it keeps paying attention to it. And you're kind of stuck in this loop. So if you get something to break that loop up, right? If you start to use this approach to direct your attention to other sounds, which is what our product does, it cycles through all the other sounds that are outside the tinnitus kind of sound and drives your attention to them. And so it just kind of dilutes the amount of attention that is given to this one percept and spreads it more evenly across your frequency response, I guess. So yeah, so that was one of the early things for me that really that I really thought. Now, to be honest, I thought that and you pointed out that we're kind of still at the early stages of this approach. I thought there would be more bimodal approaches by now. But we're actually the first ever and only FDA-approved bimodal device. So we had to, unfortunately, because nobody else had gone before us, we had to engage, in a very in-depth way with the FDA. We had to design clinical trials together and, blaze the trail together. And we have created an entire new device category as a result. So we created US regulatory history in doing that. So we were the first, and to date, there hasn't been anyone else that has followed us, but, who knows what that will hold in the future. Maybe there will be more bimodal approaches.
Yeah, and in the hearing space, we basically kind of set the stage for bimodal to come through. And there are other researchers in the space that have been trying to get some developments going. Outside of the auditory field, like Ross mentioned, mirror therapy is pretty impressive. It's trying to, it is like multimodal stim too, because you've got like your hand, and then you've got a mirror that's looking at that, reflecting that hand, and behind the mirror, you're missing your hand, your limb. And so your brain is using all those signals, and it's kind of reinforcing, and then it residually sticks around. During that time too, there were groups, doing transcranial direct current stimulation, some vagus nerve implants, and auricular and other kinds, and they were trying to reinforce for other kinds of conditions. At the time, Ross knows, I was supposed to go to DARPA for 4 years, and DARPA was really pushing paired stimulation for all sorts of health conditions and skills. So they were looking at training, military operations and combat, even like sniper shooting, and pairing electrical stim of the vagus nerve pathways with that. Other on the rehabilitation side, stroke recovery, things where it's related. People were doing it originally with transcranial magnetic stimulation, where they would try to stimulate in a motor region and reinforce some movements and try to cause paired stim. So, there were groups that were all kind of dabbling in this space. More recently, there was FDA approval for like a stroke recovery using vagus nerve implantable microtransponder. I think that's the name now they go by, right, Ross? And, they're reinforcing. So I think it's still all kind of early. There was a lot of research early on. I would say we brought it to a stage where it's much more widespread now for auditory field. But I think combined with what we've done, and then those early stage research and people kind of dabbling, you're going to start to see many more. I've had people approach me in other fields and say, oh, I've thought about this for A, B, and C, and we're trying to move it forward. So I think you're going to see in the next 5 years, maybe more bimodal, trimodal. I don't know how to say four quadrimodal, but
quadmodal. Yeah.
Quadmodal. They're going to start to come out, right? Because it's all about, how do you reinforce to your brain, like, this is important, like that's how our body works. We're constantly taking multiple inputs, and the more things that come in, the more important it is to us, right?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people, as Hubert pointed out, after we got the FDA approval, and that, it became kind of, reasonably big news, and a lot of people started coming to us with ideas. And it's any condition where the brain pays too much attention to something. This could potentially be used as a therapy for that. So we the neurotech conferences are always the most. That's where we have guys coming up to us left, right, and center. I've got you should use this for this condition.
Yeah.
And there's so about 20 conditions now that people want to try this for. But on the plus side, I suppose, now that we have regulatory approval, there is a pathway. So we've done the hard work. But that was part of a wider strategy in building credibility around this technology. So when we started to look at the tinnitus space, it was an area that was, I would say, beleaguered by credibility issues. There had been a lot of things, that had, making overinflated claims, without the evidence base to back it up, without the clinical trials, and a lot of people trying to cut corners. And I think, so we came, when we looked at the opportunity, we said, okay, we essentially want to be the category creator for this condition. So a lot like what Cochlear became for the profound deafness market, we wanted to do that for the tinnitus market. So we decided that we would work with all the top scientists. We'd do the biggest clinical trials ever conducted in the space. We'd pre-publish our protocols, and then we'd post-publish our results in top-tier peer-reviewed journals. To date now, we've 3 major publications in 3 top-tier journals. Got the cover story in Science Translational Medicine for our 10-day-1 study, Nature Scientific Reports for our 10-day-2 study, and we're currently the cover story in Nature Communications for our 10-day-3 FDA study. So, I think we've gone above and beyond to prove the credibility of the technology, of the clinical efficacy, and now what we're starting to do is publish the real world evidence. So, and we're seeing that, that the real world evidence is actually highly consistent with the clinical trial data. So we'll just keep publishing all of that data and just continuing to build the credibility of this technology for this indication until we deliver on that mission to become the category creator for tinnitus.
I mean, I'm just want to pull up and just say congrats. And how does it feel? I mean, it sounds like it's been a very arduous journey getting to where you all are. And I'm sure there might be some people out there that might appreciate just a little bit of color around what those days were like in terms of, did you think that you'd get this far? Were there times where, it felt like you wouldn't ever get through that FDA approval process? I just feel like that, as we were talking about at the top of the conversation or before we started recording, is you see these exciting new technologies that sort of come to light, and they promise the sky, and there's all these, grandiose ambitions and all that. And then reality hits, and, actually bringing and materializing an idea in bringing it to fruition, and then, to make it even that much more challenging, doing it in a regulatory environment that's extremely rigorous. You had to define the category. You guys have achieved a lot, and it's probably pretty gratifying. We were kind of joking about, it's like you kind of surpass these hurdles and you get to it, and it's just, okay, good job. It's like you don't ever really get a chance to. You're always moving on to the next target, the next goal. But I think it's worth at least maybe, having a little introspection and saying, wow, what an accomplishment it is to even get to this far, so that you can get to the point to where you can do these real world clinical trials. And like I said, at this year's ADA, I mean, I think that was kind of the talk of the conference, was that you're putting your money where your mouth is, more or less. There's all kinds of evidence now that supports what once was hypothesis. And again, kudos to you guys for persevering through what I perceive to be just an incredibly challenging sort of process that's rife with, arbitrary red tape, or just things that don't seem to make any sense, and you just have to battle through it.
Yeah, maybe I'll just give.
Joke,
Oh, go ahead.
said myself and Hubert started out looking like young men when we started this journey. Unfortunately, Hubert still looks like you. No, that's just telling me I care more.
Yeah, oh, you just got to smile more, Ross.
But yeah, I'll let Hubert talk.
Yeah. The one thing I'll say, I mean, thank you, David, because it was a long journey, and it's challenging because like there's a lot of steps you have to do to bring something to FDA approval, and I didn't take it lightly joining Neuromod because two things. One is I was going to start my own company in this space, and I am a professor at the University of Minnesota, so as an academic, it's critical to maintain rigor and transparency in the process. When I was considering to come over to Neuromod to serve as the chief scientific officer, it was very important that I understood and knew for sure, as sure as you can be, that they would support large-scale clinical trials and figure it out. Because at the time, when we talked, we said, look, like there's something here, but we have to convince folks. We have to convince ourselves. We need to figure out like what are effective parameters, what's working, what's not, right? And so in academia, it's hard to run large scale studies. You could go for grants, there's lag time. It would take even longer. And so when I met Ross and the board members and the investors and so forth, they came from the pharma industry. So it was really refreshing because from the device field, it's like, we could do 15 patients, we could do 20 patients. Here, it was like, yeah, we could do hundreds. And I was like, wait, what? Can we really do hundreds of patients? And it was like, yeah, let's do this right. Let's, run a series of studies. I said, look, it's going to take a few, clinical trials, and we'll converge in what works. Now, to share that with the community was challenging because every study we're going to do, it would be under high scrutiny. And it was like, is that study properly designed? And we tried multiple times to explain that we're doing a progression. This, even in the title of the protocol paper, we said parameter optimization study. And then for the longest time, people kept saying, well, why didn't you run? That was a terrible controlled clinical trial. And we're like, we called it a parameter optimization. So, it was just this kind of messaging and trying to get it across, why we're doing what we're doing. And, it was also a lot of pressure from individuals, like, why are you taking so long? Or, why didn't you do it this way or that way? So we tried our best. We put protocol papers published. Even the papers that we did finish the clinical trials, if you look on there, and kudos to Dr. Rich Tyler for suggesting this, I thought it was a great idea. We have these scatter plots where it's like all, each individual participant, the data that we have, we put that on there, right? So people might criticize the way we analyze the data or how it might be presented. I mean, that's all fine. Everyone has, their opinions, and we totally accept that. But they could go to the papers and they could look at the data and they can make their own assessments, which many people did. And they look at, and see what happens. And so we've kept that rigor, we've kept that transparency, and each stage of the way, we present the paper, we, do podcasts, we do our best at conferences. I was presenting the results. I won't lie, I felt like I got punched a couple times in the stomach and the face, for people that didn't like the design, but, totally understand this is a science field. We need to take that and then do better, right? That's the idea. And FDA, I have to say, I mean, they were very collaborative. I think a lot of times people may have bad experience with FDA, but that's because they're not engaging them earlier. They have a tough job. They have a lot of information they have to process. They got tight timelines and they're doing the best they can and they care. That's why they do the job. And we're all just trying to get to the same place. So that was where we engaged FDA early. And it was just very refreshing and supportive to see them so collaborative. And they'll say, look, that's not enough for us. Okay, this is exciting. That's meaningful. You need to design it this way. Now, I will say the clinical trial, which we'll get to later, was a high bar. And I'll explain to you later why. So we were like, that's going to be a very tough study because we're not showing relative to sham. We're showing relative to like treatment, already. But we managed to get through that and they were very supportive. So I will say, yeah, I mean, it's a tough journey. It took some, we could have probably explained it better to the community and found ways to do that. It's a learning process for us too, because we're just moving so, quickly and trying to get what we could out there. But in the end, I'm happy, really proud, Ross, of what we've been able to do. Not perfect, but hopefully, your audience and the community understand that, we're doing the best we could within the constraints we had. And, we know it's not still the perfect study or the perfect situation, and we're going to keep, striving to improve the treatment. And we're always happy for feedback, right? And collaborative discussion, which we do. We bring all the people that criticize or support us, and we bring them together, and we always have discussions about it, right? To move it to the next stage.
Yeah, I think as Hubert, as we look back, having kind of sophisticated and very supportive investors was so important. And so there's a venture capital firm based out of Dublin called Fountain Healthcare Partners, and they got behind us. And as Hubert said, they come from the kind of pharma, kind of biotech space. So they took that lens and brought it over to the kind of device space. And I think they could see that the size of the opportunity, and I think they could see what we were trying to achieve. And, I think we engaged the top scientists, our science advisory board, Berthold Languth, who's one of probably the most published scientists in the tinnitus space, Sven Van Est, Deborah Hall, Rich Tyler, all these guys, that we brought together, and they helped us inform our designs, our clinical trial designs. And then I think we just went for it, with the kind of philosophy, no guts, no glory. You have to go for it. And I think that Hubert's right. I don't think everybody fully understood what we were trying to do, that we were kind of refining, working through a couple of phases of exploratory trials where we worked through parameter settings, where we worked through patient subtyping, getting to that ultimate point where we knew what was the most effective form of the treatment and who was it most effective for, which is what we got to with the pivotal trial. When we took that to the FDA, and then kind of very collaborative, I would totally agree with Hubert. They were incredibly collaborative and great partners to work with. We worked through and came up with a design that gave them what they needed, and got us, the approval. So, so it's been a very challenging but incredibly rewarding journey over the last, 10 plus years, since I guess we've been working on this.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so let's talk about some of those clinical trials. I'm curious, without going too far down into the weeds, understanding what made it so challenging, as you alluded to there, Hubert, some of these rigorous parameters. And then also, what were you sort of learning throughout that process? As you said, the whole point was to iterate on the parameters itself. So I'd be very curious of kind of just in broad strokes, understanding sort of the clinical trial piece, and then ultimately how you were able to progress it along to the point to where you got to where you are now, where now you're at the point where you're collecting real world data. Because I think that ultimately sheds some more light on, like you said at the top, Ross, it's like you have to obviously do this in a way that is very, very rigorous. Maybe that's why this hasn't been well defined in the past. And so it would just be, I'd be really curious to hear more about that portion of your guys' story.
I could probably start here. There are a few things, right? Like one, I think probably, David, you've heard before is, the control condition, and the sham, right? This has always been coming up. And, what people may or may not know is that the bimodal stim approach, we started in Europe and in Dublin, Ireland particularly. People already aware. I was aware of the technology. I Googled it. I knew mute button. I at the time, that was the name of it. And so, and it's super threshold. The tongue, you can feel it. The sound, you can hear it. And you might be able to trick some individuals into saying, hey, you're getting stimulated, but you don't feel it. But there's a lot of risk there to try to design a study based on deceit to have a sham control, because if it is a good design, but if it fails, then it's kind of the worst design you could do if you have that bias, right? So there's no way we could have. I know people say we could have, but we thought about this thoroughly, and even FDA through the discussions, we couldn't come up with a solution. There was not a blinded sham control way to do the study. So the alternative, which is actually, in my opinion, a more rigorous design, is to do an active control. That's harder because you're actually trying to find differences in effects that you're expecting, but one is going to be more effective than another one, right? And to me, that's actually the true gold standard, because that can be fully blinded. There's no questioning, were they really, thinking that they got the treatment or not, even though they got the sham. And also you can actually look at parameters and so forth. So all of our studies, 10A1 and 10A2, were designed that way with active controls, right? So that's how we designed it. We explained that, but somehow, I don't know, Ross, we probably maybe could have made some more visuals or something to help people understand that. But that was something that we did hear a lot about. And when I explained it to people, just sitting down and chatting, people got that point, right? So I would say that that's one. The other is parameter optimization, right? Where do you start? Because you have so many settings that you have to look into. It was the tongue parameters, the sound features, the timing, the different kinds of background sounds. And so, you could either do like 10 settings and do 10 patients each or participants, but then we're back to the challenge we discussed before with the small numbers with MedTech, right? So what we did was we actually bundled. We bundled a lot of settings together in, for example, 10A1 was 3 arms, and there were 3 bundled settings that had many things or multiple things that were different across settings. And, there's criticisms there that, well, how are you going to know which it is if you're changing so many settings, across the arms? But this is the strategy we took, pros and cons. People may have their view if that was, the best way or not. But we took that strategy and we did that through 10A1 and 10A2. And what ended up happening then is that we started to narrow in. And so from 10A1 to 10A2, and finally when we started to approach 10A3, we realized the critical things ultimately are tones and tongue stimulation. And, pairing in a precise timing, and I'm not too shocked by this, is that it doesn't have to be on the millisecond level. And when you think about Pavlov's dog, actually the dog salivating also happened to the footsteps of the person bringing the food when they heard the footstep sound. So, there is some window there, but the key thing was paired association to a certain extent with tongue stem and sound, right? Tones, tongue stem and tones. And then 10A3 then led where FDA said, okay, now you need to show that, yes, it looks like both are critical, but you need to show that with the tones, and then you add the tongue on top of it, that the tongue stimulation provides additional critical benefit above the tones alone. And that was what FDA wanted us to prove in 10A3, right? So that's the progression that happened. We narrowed it down, and then FDA said, this is the last piece. You got to show that that's effective. And that's what we achieved in 10A3.
Yeah, and what I'd add to it is I think, it's important for people to realize how challenging or how high a bar that is. So the patient's got 6 weeks of sound alone. So they'll sound therapy was already a kind of one of the standards of care. So, they will have gotten benefit in that first 6 weeks. And then when we introduced the bimodal, the tongue stimulation, they wanted to see, additional and synergistic benefit that outperformed what they saw in the sound therapy alone. So that's like, if you go to the doctor and, you get an antibiotic or something, it will do, a lot of the handling the infection or whatever. Then if you get any additional medicines after that, they should have marginal benefit, right? Because the first one has done the bulk of the heavy lifting. Now we had to show that the second intervention outperformed the first one, So it's an incredibly high bar.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, so so I think a lot of the subtlety of that is missed on a lot of people. That because usually, when you give a second medicine or a third medicine, the additional benefit is only, minorly incremental. Whereas this, we had to show it outperformed the first one.
Yeah, but it's actually even more intense than that, David, because it's, it's like, let's say you get 30% benefit in the first phase or 40%. That means that you can't just get 40% after. You have to get like 60%.
Right.
So that means you have to have an increasing slope of benefit. So it's like, that's after they already got benefit. Then you've got to show what happened in the first stage to sound and actually beat that. So you're getting an increasing slope of benefit, which, of course, when we heard that, we're like, oh, geez, that's not even compared to sham. I would have taken a sham control any day because that's just showing benefit to, placebo. We're talking about placebo and sound effect and then surpassing that after we've already had benefit in the first stage. So that was a bit, if it didn't work out, we wouldn't know if it was actually beneficial or not.
Yeah.
Because if we had done it to sham, it could have been better than sham, right? And
I
placebo.
agree.
Yeah,
I
so
agree.
that was a risk,
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, sham study would have been easier,
yeah, yeah.
And I think people who are, particularly people who've worked in active implantable devices, or they get that, right? They get what a high bar this is to overcome. And I think people are starting to get it and starting to appreciate it. And if people read the paper, as I said, it's currently the cover story on Nature Comms. So if they go onto the Nature Communications webpage, they'll see it there. And read the paper. It was a high bar to overcome, so we're very proud of it as an achievement.
If you allow me to be a little bit geeky here, David, so Nature Communications is a very top journal. They don't accept a lot of papers, and then they publish because it's an open journal. They publish a few hundred papers a month, right, for all different categories, and they pick one paper to put on their website for multiple weeks, and that's our paper up there. So I was really proud.
That's really
of that.
cool.
Yeah, I mean and it's up there. You go to the website, the main page, and you see our featured paper. And so it was nice to know. And by the way, we put up, like I said, transparency. The reviews up there, our comments are up there, our data's up there. I mean, I don't know what else more to showcase unless I show the inside of my body, and put it up there too. It's or my brain. Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad though that, like, I know that we kind of got into the weeds a bit there, but I think it's actually really important to illustrate just what a high bar that you guys had to clear was, which I think really does validate the legitimacy of this. I mean, to your point, I didn't know that about the FDA, and that you had to basically show that it outperformed and something that has already existed, which are the sound therapies, and so you had to prove that there was an incremental benefit that was even greater than the whatever that ceiling is, I guess. But I think that really helps to illustrate, like, we've been operating at a ceiling. You can basically provide this much marginal benefit for somebody, and you've shattered that. And you guys are proving that there's actually a lot more room of benefit that you can provide people, which I think that it was probably a pretty challenging study to go through. But by being on the other side of it in the way that you are, it's kind of undeniable that you've gone through a really rigorous methodology here that really illustrates the efficacy of this versus the kind of the status quo.
Yeah, I think, and like, I don't want to denigrate the hearing industry. I think it's an amazing industry, and my own daughter has hearing loss issues and benefits from the technologies that the industry develops. I work in the industry. I'm wholly committed to it. But I think that notable regulatory approvals are probably rare enough, because it's probably FDA clearances. So when you see products are more likely to be FDA cleared, which means that they've gone via the 510K. So they didn't have to go through the rigors that we had to go. We're FDA approved, and that's a big difference. It's another thing that I've found people don't quite get the subtlety of the difference between the two. We had to actually put clinical data in front of the FDA. Their statisticians, their ENTs, their audiologists, all of their experts had to, go through a rigorous review of that data and approve this product on that basis. So it's quite unique in that regard. And, that's why, listen, anyone who is unfortunate enough to follow me on LinkedIn knows that one of my favorite hashtags is first and only. I'm just incredibly proud that we put everything on the line for that approval, and we are the first and only FDA approved bimodal device for the treatment of tinnitus. So very proud of that piece of work.
That's awesome. Okay, so I know we're getting tight on time here. To kind of wrap up, I wanted to, kind of bring this whole thing, to its conclusion, talking about where you are now. Like I said, it was all over the place at ADA, and it's just kind of been the talk of so many different conversations that I've had. I think people are genuinely really, really excited about this. I think people are trying to temper expectations even a little bit and try not to get too carried away. I know that at the booth, Ross, I was talking with Emily, up in Alaska, and it sounds like you have an efficacy rate of about 92%. So the question is, well, what's going on with those 8% of people? And so I guess it's kind of this like never ending pursuit of, well, how do you make sure that this is as universally applicable as possible? But I wanted to give you guys a chance to just kind of close this out here, talking about, where what that real world data is showing, sort of these early results from the clinicians that are Lenire certified. I think even maybe talking about this network and how you can join it as a clinician. What the plans kind of look like from that standpoint. I think in 2025, I think a lot of clinicians are going to be looking at this as something that they are very intrigued by and would like to get involved. And so I think here's a good opportunity to kind of share with them what the vision is in terms of building out this network and kind of what you're seeing from these early adopters.
Ross, maybe I'll just talk briefly on the clinical side, and then you could close it up, in the closure here. But this is the thing, like I'm a scientist when it comes down to it, and I'm never going to be happy or satisfied with where things are unless it's 100%, and that will never happen. So in other words, my whole life, I'll never be satisfied. That's really what it comes down to. But like in our studies with our current version, it's about 2/3 that we're seeing in the clinical trials. And I was already, our team was already quite happy with that. In the US, at least, it was quite astonishing to see when you add in a lot of these other factors, because in the clinical trial, we try to keep it treatment and move it along, but systematically. And, you always wonder when it goes to real world, how it's going to behave because it's not so systematic. And we thought, okay, it might be a little bit lower, maybe 50% to 2/3, right? Now we're hitting 80 to 90% in these clinics. And I think, honestly, it's a lot of other factors that are contributing to that level of success, right? That are 90%. Emily's just amazing, caring person who's treating these tinnitus patients. And you add in some of the other things that she's observing and helping with them combined with Lenire, and we're hitting that level. I will say that for me personally, and Ross, we talked about on the company side, we want to make the treatment also better in addition to, these other factors that will contribute. And so we are looking at ways to make the treatment more customized for each individual, because it's a one size fits all, right? Well, it's not one size fits all. I mean, we calibrate to the audiograms and we do some other things, but in terms of the tinnitus itself, we do want to make sure that the stimuli are presented that are going to be optimized for each individual. And I do think if we move that direction, on a general scale, we can get that higher to like 70 to 80%. And then you mix that in with a lot of these other factors, we will start to approach 90 to, not 100, but 90, 95% across multiple clinics, right? So that's my hope from a scientific clinical perspective. And we are moving in that direction because we don't want to stop. We want to keep getting better and better. And so that from our clinical science program, that's our goal there. And I'll let Ross talk about, the other business and more access side too, right?
Yeah, what I'd say is, Hubert said, we saw a certain efficacy rate in the clinical trials, and we've started talking about it in terms of the 3 Ps. So in the clinical trial, we evaluated the product as a standalone, that intervention. But layered on top of that now in the real world, we work with the best providers and we make sure that they, are trained and work as per the best processes. So it's product, provider, and process. And, as we roll out across the US and we have our provider network now, what we're seeing is that the addition of those, of the provider and process laid on top of the product, we're seeing efficacy rates, as you said, in the 80, 90%, and in addition to that, responder rates, we see mean improvements that are in the 30 points, 40 points, 50 points. So I would say that we're, as Hubert says, we're wholly committed to improving on all fronts. And so that's what we're really trying to do. Our mission is to advance tinnitus education and care for providers and patients, So, and I think we're building a movement now around this. I think there's a lot of excitement. People are hearing about the real world results. and we're getting a lot of enthusiasm at the provider level. It's always been there at the patient level. Patients have always been looking for a solution for tinnitus. And I think we're at the start of a very exciting journey, and it's only going to get better from here. And, I think it's a great time. We've just heard that Apple are moving into the hearing space with over-the-counter. So I think, the industry there's going to be a lot of changes and a lot of exciting dynamics. And what I would say, it's a really good time for audiologists to think about clinically specializing. And tinnitus is just it can be hugely challenging, but it's a hugely rewarding field because literally some of these patients are so incredibly impacted. And if you can turn things around for them, the improvement in quality of life and how appreciative those patients are, it's quite dramatic.
Couldn't agree more. I'm really excited from that standpoint. I think that it couldn't have come at a better time to have a company that's really offering tinnitus therapy and treatment. And I think that it ties into a lot of what's been discussed on this podcast about the sort of existential need to specialize, particularly as an audiologist. And I think that this presents a really interesting avenue for people that can offer this, that we know there's so much crossover between the patient demographic. And, for the longest time, we've had treatment for hearing loss, but we haven't for tinnitus. And so the thought of that becoming resolved, we're talking about, I think, a total addressable market that could quite literally be bigger than the hearing loss market. So anyway, really, really exciting stuff. Could not thank you guys enough for coming on and sharing all this information. I'm really excited to see what 2025 holds. I know that there's a long line of providers and clinicians that are very eager to learn more about this and potentially become a provider. And I hope that in 2025 we see this really expand in a big way. And all the different people out in the country that are dealing with debilitating tinnitus, hopefully it becomes as easy as them just finding where their closest Lenire provider is, and people really starting to see this. I have to imagine that, as things really start to get going, that the sort of compounding effect of the word of mouth, the power of that, when physicians and other medical professionals start to get wind of this becoming an option and that it's dispensed through an audiologist, you can kind of see how this could really actually be a game changer, and not say that, just sort of as like a cliche.
Yep. Couldn't agree more.
Awesome.
Thank you, David, for saying all that.
Absolutely. Awesome, guys. Well, it's a real pleasure to have you on today. Thanks so much for everybody who tuned in here to the end, and we will chat with you next time. Cheers.